Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Dark Horse Hour of Horror. It's our virtual panel for New York Comic Con. I'm your moderator, Anthony Morrow. I'm going to let the rest of my esteemed panelists introduce themselves, starting with Dave Alexander.
Hi, my name is Dave Alexander. I'm a filmmaker and writer, former editor-in-chief of Rue Morgue magazine, and the author of Untold Horror for Dark Horse, which came out recently, and I'm super excited to be here.
Tyler, let's go to you.
Hey, my name is Tyler Crook. I'm an artist and writer. I've worked on books like BPRD, Harrow County. I've done a couple Black Hammer books, and right now I'm working on a unannounced book that I'm writing and drawing.
And David.
Hi, everybody. Dave Dastmalchian. I'm very excited to try and trick Tyler into revealing clues about his secret project. And we know it will be redacted, so there's going to be lots of blacked out parts of this panel. I am the creator of Count Crowley, Reluctant Midnight Monster Hunter for Dark Horse, and Volume 2 will be hitting a shelf dripping blood somewhere near you soon.
It's true. All of that is true. And it's okay. If Tyler spills the beans on his secret project, I don't edit these panels before we send them to New York because, you know, it's more fun that way for me.
I didn't know I was doing a panel with a bunch of feds.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. And everybody watching at home, thank you for joining us on this already off the rails panel. For everybody on the panel, what about horror drew you into it initially? Everything, Dave, you have worked on in your career at Rue Morgue and everything you're doing now, Untold Horror, it's very much covering the whole gamut of the horror genre. Tyler, Harrow County, arguably one of the most important recent horror series Dark Horse has put out in recent years, kind of in my opinion, in a way, kind of launched into this resurgence of like horror excellence at Dark Horse. And David, Count Crowley, just a really fun take on the idea of a monster hunting series, marrying that with like this kind of horror show host that we kind of all remember, have like these vague memories of like the Crypt Keeper. And I know some of my friends still have nightmares of the Crypt Keeper from that original show back when we were very young. So what drew you into these horror as a genre, and then the subgenres you're choosing to kind of explore in the mediums you're working in currently? It's a big question. I know. I'm very sorry.
It is, but it's a great question. I can trace it back to a few key things. I think one of them is dinosaurs, because when you're a kid, dinosaurs are like a gateway drug into the world of horror, because your parents allow you to learn about dinosaurs. And so it's sort of this acceptable type of monster that's not considered frivolous. And so that was a big one for me. But I would say a really key moment was just discovering Frankenstein, which was before I was allowed to watch any of the movies with him. It was all about Halloween decorations and pictures and little rubber toys and stuff like that. And then one day my parents taped a double feature, the original Universal Dracula and Frankenstein, and I rewatched it on VHS over and over again, probably to their dismay. And that got me hooked. And to this day, Frankenstein is still my go-to monster. He's my guy.
Very cool. Tyler, David, either one of you.
You want to start, David?
Okay, I'll start. And guys, like seriously, if the noise in the background is way too overwhelming, let me know and I'll just go find a place to sit up outside and we'll have to just pause for a second. But I will say my gateway drug was thanks to the incredible Friday night nightmare hosted by Cremation Mortem, where I grew up in Kansas City. She was our local horror host, and she turned me on to the horror of horror, but also the communal kind of experience of watching horror together and kind of facing these things in the dark together. And I was super scared of this stuff because a lot of reasons. I think all kids are scared of monsters in the dark and death, but also I was raised in a really religious atmosphere where they were the taboo. It was very forbidden to talk about things like witchcraft and reanimating dead bodies and monsters and transformations and the occult and all this stuff that we were raised to be afraid of. And so that combined with a pretty early discovery of horror comics, including, now these were put out by Apple, but Marvel's The Blood of Dracula, Tomb of Dracula was stuff pretty early on that I was able to discover like old copies of kind of vintage horror comics that meant a lot to me. And I thought those stories and a lot of that early black and white art that I would just pour over was, to me, I think the first, as a recovering addict, I know what it feels like to get that first taste of something that then you chase, you're chasing that dragon, if you will, for the rest of your life. And I think all of us on this panel probably feel that same way, that sensation we got the first time that, you watched, Lon Chaney Jr. transform into the wolf, the first time you saw, Leather kick open the door and grab his first victim in Texas Chainsaw. Like those are visceral experiences that do something to us that is super fun, but I have so many ideas on why it's also like super meaningful to us. So yeah, that was kind of my first toke of the the roach.
Very cool. Tyler, how about you?
Well, I think I definitely didn't come to horror through movies, like most of my peers have. Like when I was growing up, those were like, they were too intense for me. Like I didn't see Friday the 13th until I was well into not Friday the 13th, like Nightmare on Elm Street I saw in my mid to late 20s. I still haven't seen like all of the Friday the 13th movies. But my intro to horror was through music, through bands like, Bauhaus and Misfits and the Cramps.
Right.
And stuff like that. And then also David Lynch was like the first sort of horror that I really clicked with. And I think it was partially because it was less like sort of slashery and more, it involved with making like the horror of living in suburbia into like a true horror thing. And that's what really got me into the horror thing. Because I think my attraction to it and the thing I try to do with most of my books is to find a way in horror to express, to sort of explore some sort of human condition. And I think horror is just perfectly suited to exploring that kind of stuff.
I mean, I definitely agree. Having been still to this day, a huge Stephen King reader myself, which was kind of my second introduction to horror after I watched Alien way too young. Yeah. It very much is. I mean, I'm going to butcher this quote by Stephen King, but he says something along the lines of like, it's horror is very recognizable, but you elongate the proportions in just different ways. So you're just wondering like that thing under the sheet looks human, but it's clearly not, and that's terrifying. Somebody go look up the real, people watching at home, go look up the real quote. It's so much better than what I just said. But that kind of is actually a perfect segue into talking about Harrow County a little bit, because it very much, maybe not necessarily the horrors of living in suburbia, but it very much is the horrors of living in a town with people and trying to protect those people, but also protect yourself from those people in a really terrifying way. And what I found most horrifying about Harrow County was just like, I just want these people to be happy, but literally everything from like the very real monsters to just the circumstances of their existence keeps them from being happy, especially at the time period you guys set the book at. And just it's such a beautifully upsetting series. So what about kind of your first experience into horror bled over into Harrow County?
That's a good question. Like I think the thing working with Cullen Bunn, Cullen and I are really simpatico in this, I think, where we're very interested in exploring horror, but really focusing it on characters and that emotional arc of specific characters. And I think I guess one of the things with Harrow County that specifically I was trying to do was trying to sort of merge that sort of primal. I feel like there's a primal connection between horror and beauty. Like there's so many times when, especially since I've moved to Oregon, where I'll be like in like an old growth forest and just be like, it is so friggin' beautiful here that I'm a little bit scared. You know, it's just like, and I try a lot to do with that. I tried to do that a lot with Harrow County, where the sort of horror and beauty of nature was brought into that, but also, so that was sort of my contribution. But I think Cullen's was really focused on bringing sort of the horror and beauty of just being a human in a community of other humans, and how we're all sort of struggling with different ideas of who we are and who we should be. And sort of everyone in Harrow County is dealing with that on some sort of a real level.
Yeah, absolutely. David, Count Crowley. So obviously you kind of brought up your local town's horror hosts, and you know, similarities between her and Count Crowley are apparent. But how about you talk about just kind of everything that led into the creation of Count Crowley, from your perspective?
Totally. So, you know, growing up and being such a fan of the late night horror host in Kansas City, and coming from a small town and a smaller community, being in Kansas City and feeling like, what is our place in the national kind of scheme of things, is something I was always interested in for some reason as a young person. Like, that's interesting. Like, do the people in Cleveland or even New York City or Los Angeles, these big mysterious places you hear about, do they know about Kansas City? Do they know about Cremation Mortem? Do they know, you know, do they watch you know, the Lon Chaney movies, or do they watch the Castle movies? And do they, like, it was weird thoughts that I would have pretty young. And I started in my comic book reading years, that as I got more serious about and more passionate about my love for comic books, which really took off in my teens, wondering about, you know, kind of fantasizing about telling a story about a guy who's a horror host. And what if there was like this network of horror hosts in different cities in different parts of the country who use that as their cover, you know, to actually secretly battle monsters. And then, you know, films like Fright Night, which had a major impact on me, and Roddy McDowall's entire character arc in that is, you know, tied right into my thought, as well as, you know, The Lost Boys and the whole use of like horror comics for mythology, and where do we get our information about how we fight monsters. So all that was like a cool idea, but it wasn't like a fully fleshed out idea. It had some neat bones and some cool like window dressing, but it was not like a pulsing heart of a story yet. And then I grew up and I continued to collect comics. I continued to love telling stories. I continued to love horror, and I battled addiction and mental illness, and found, you know, this lifelong journey of sobriety and mental wellness that I have been a part of, as well as being, you know, a citizen in a country that, in my opinion, was, you know, is currently under the threat of, you know, dangerously dogmatic, you know, mental unwellness and abuse that is propagated in a great way by patriarchy that is unchecked, and a manipulation and abuse of news, media, and information, and an abuse of miseducation. And so, you know, as I became a grown-up, and this idea about the horror host fighting monsters started taking shape, I started to wonder about, like, what if all we've been fed, what if all the fake news we've been given about monsters has been a lie? What if, you know, wooden stakes don't kill vampires? What if silver bullets don't kill a werewolf? What if that's just been myths spread by people in power? And what if this horror host isn't part of a big sprawling network? What if this is just somebody that's inherited maybe the last mantle of a bygone, you know, movement that wasn't considered necessary anymore? So appointed horror monster hunters are just an anomaly now. And then as these recent years, unfolded, and I was confronted with, the stories told by some of the most inspiring women in my life about their battles against, toxic patriarchy and toxic work environments, and the things that these incredibly strong women in my life have had to endure and face, and persevere through. I was like, what if Jerry isn't Jerry? What if it's Jerri and it's a woman, and nobody thinks she can do this, because how could a woman ever be a monster hunter in 1983 in Missouri? That was the idea. I pitched it to actually a television producer, because I wanted to try and develop it as a television series that we could make into a comic. And he said, no, we should retcon that, do the comic book, and then see if anybody likes it. And I got to pitch it to Dark Horse, and Dark Horse thankfully liked the idea enough. They took a shot with me, and now we're going into our second volume. That's a long answer. Sorry. I'm a long-winded mother flower and actor. So sorry about it. I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay. Dave, let's move on to you, because you have a very different project with us here at Dark Horse, not necessarily comics related, but very much steeped in the kind of history of horror cinema. So A, would you care to explain the project to our viewers at home? And B, how did it come to fruition? How did it come about? What were those conversations, and what was it like pulling all of this together?
So the book is called Untold Horror, and it's basically the stories behind genre films that were never made. And so we've got 13 chapters. We interview the creators, the people that worked on them. They tell their stories. And then one of the things that we wanted to do with the book, which was, I'm really glad Dark Horse sort of set that from the outset, was to make sure it had strong visuals. So every chapter is accompanied by visuals, pre-production art that nobody's ever seen, for example, posters that were created for unused films. And so it's this sort of secret history. And one of the things that I really love about it is that in some cases you can learn a lot more about an artist from the work that they didn't bring to screen than the work that they did bring to screen. Like a great example is George Romero. He was very supportive of this. And we interviewed him for 2 hours, and he wanted us to come back because he had written so many scripts that had never got made. And he had so many ideas for things that were outside of the world of zombies that he didn't get to realize, largely because he got pigeonholed. And so a lot of these creators that we love, they have a whole other side to them, and nobody ever asks them about that stuff. And so giving them the opportunity was really rewarding. And just for me as a horror geek, I mean, I guess conceptually, it sort of started at Rue Morgue, where you'd hear news about a project that was going to come out, and then it didn't come out. So it kind of came like water cooler talk, like, oh, well, what happened to, that Clive Barker film that got announced and then just disappeared into the ether? Why does that happen? You wonder as a fan. And so I got talking about this with a screenwriting partner of mine named Mark Polisel when we were at the Fantasia Film Festival several years ago. We decided instead of going to yet another party, we would just go sit and chat. And we had been to the marketplace earlier that day where people had been pitching their films. And that got us on the subject of how, very few of these are actually going to get made and what happened to all these other films. And it just kind of grew from there. And we always envisioned it as a series. So we ended up shooting, I think we've got over 30 interviews in the can. And one of the people we were working with, filmmaker Tim Sullivan, he's worked with Dark Horse before. And he said, let me talk to Dark Horse, and, maybe there's a book in there. And sure enough, there was. Dark Horse liked the idea. And so we had a bunch of material we could draw on that, interviews we'd already conducted. And then a bunch of it, we just phoned up people. And then a lot of it was just doing research, trying to find out, where did some of this art go? Who owns it? How do we get permission to show it? So yeah, it was a bit of an odyssey, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a very cool book. All these books we're talking about are very cool books. Go pick them up. You won't be sorry. You being the viewer at home. But I guess with Untold Horror, just I mean, hearing you describe the process just very much sounds like a labor of love. It very much sounds like, not necessarily the easiest thing to put together. What were some of the challenges in trying to put it together, trying to track some of this stuff down? And was there stuff that you would have loved to make it into the book that just wasn't able to be in there for like licensing rights reasons?
There's definitely some stuff like that. I would say probably the biggest aspect of that would be there's some incredible stories for films that didn't get made, but they never got to a stage where any art was created.
Right.
And in a way that made things easier because it gave us a little bit more focus. I mean, there's, dozens of Romero projects I would have loved to talk about, but we happen to have these really cool comic book style storyboards that Bob Layton did for a project that would have been sort of the first Marvel superhero movie back in the 80s, directed by George Romero. And so that gave us a path forward, which was really great. And then, sometimes it's just nobody kind of knows who owns it anymore. I think the one that took the most work was Jaws 3 People Zero, which is in the book. Joe Dante was going to direct it. It was going to be a National Lampoon movie. So they were going to take sort of a hard turn on the franchise and make it a comedy. There was a script done for it, a lot of interesting people involved. And I'd always seen the black and white image for it. And in the process of making the book, a full color original painting popped up online from an auction house. So I contact the auction house. They can't tell me who bought it, but they provided the image and gave us permission to use their photo of it. So then, you start going down a rabbit hole. I ended up finding Maddie Simmons's number. Maddie Simmons was one of the National Lampoon guys, and he was producing stuff like Animal House. And so he was one of the major players in this. I found his phone number online and I just called him up out of the blue and he answered and I interviewed him, and that ended up being like about a month before he passed. So I got really lucky with that, but he had no clue who had it. Joe Dante didn't have any clue who might've done it. And then, so it looked like a certain artist's art. So I'd contact them. They say, no, it wasn't me. Anyways, and on this went for a while until we kind of figured out it was sort of a work for hire from an ad agency that's been defunct for a long time. And Universal said, we don't know who owns it, but we're not going to stop you from using it. So at the end of the day, we're like, all right, due diligence. Let's get this thing in print. So we get to show it in print for the first time, and it's kind of glorious, and it made all the work worthwhile. It's very satisfying.
That's super cool. That's really awesome.
I really like that double thing where it's like the horror movies and then the horror of getting a horror movie made through Hollywood. Like that's wonderful.
Yeah. It really is just you're living through the whole process of trying to bring horror to the big screen.
Development hell for a reason, right?
Yeah.
I just wrapped a movie this week called The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Some say Demeter. It's a big debate, but it's from the chapter in Dracula, when the ship carries Dracula and his belongings to London. And this film has been trying to be made for 20 years. And I was talking to one of the producers who's been a part of it for 20 years. And how many times it was just relegated to, this is never getting made, this is never getting done. And now it's finally been made. And I'm really glad. Your book is so awesome, by the way, Dave. And like the whole idea behind it is so awesome, and everybody needs to get it. But I'm glad that Last Voyage isn't going to ultimately someday be in like volume 6 of Untold Horror,
True.
Yeah, true. Last Voyage, that sounds like an awesome movie. Holy crap. Very excited for that. This is for all of you, and this might be an easier question than what I've lobbed at you so far, but what do you individually think makes effective horror?
Oh, I'll say characters and their relationships. I think that if they're singular journey, like isolation pieces, the characters so vital, because if we don't relate to and connect with the characters in some way, then the horror that they're going to endure doesn't mean anything to us. You know, we don't want to just observe people that we feel completely detached and removed from. And I mean, this spans even ridiculously fun, campy pictures. I feel like, you know, Return of the Living Dead, you still feel like this group of outsiders and like kind of, you know, left out people or whatever, that like there's ways you can connect with and relate to any of the well-made horror. And I think that goes, yeah, from camp to like high drama Exorcist type films, you know, audition movies like that, to you know, that to me is everything. It's the characters, and that you're giving the audience some way that they can sit in the passenger seat of that character for the read. When you start thumbing through like some of the really well-made horror comics of today, and Harrow County, it's a great example. Even comics that aren't about human beings, beasts of burden, you know, and to branch outside. It's so much great stuff in the Dark Horse realm, as you know, but across different publishers as well. I think a lot of what Rodney Barnes is doing with Philadelphia, and now you can really get into the minds of these characters and the characters. That's where it all starts for me.
Yeah, I think that's the base of it. And this is a good opportunity for me to just state, like, I'm a huge fan of both of your guys' work. I've got Count Crowley, got Harrow County, and I think they are two of the reason I'm such a fan is they're two of the strongest examples of sort of character-based horror. So you spend the time, it feels genuine, and you need to, especially for, I think, people who consume a lot of horror, a lot of media, you need to go beyond sort of the tropes. Horror is full of tropes. So if you're deep into it, you're going to recognize when somebody has spent the time to give you a real character. Like, you know, Jerry Barton, for example, we spend more time getting to know her than we do the monsters, which is how it should be. So then when she starts confronting the monsters, it's actually meaningful. And in Harrow County, you know, we learn about the whole community. And again, it's like David was saying, it's about outsiders. And everyone at some point feels like an outsider. So if you do it right, I think you can connect with your audience. Even if, you know, this character is a different gender and a lot younger and lives in a part of the world that you've never been to, or maybe, you know, even it's like Hellboy, who's like a demon, but you can connect with him because essentially he's kind of a petulant child and he still wants to be loved. Yeah, exactly. And so all of these examples are characters that we can connect with. And then the really good writing comes in when you've got fantastical characters, but at the bedrock of these characters are really humanistic qualities that we connect with and that touch us. And so Dark Horse has been really good at recognizing those types of stories and putting them out. And, you know, I'm super happy to be here with two of the greatest creators to exemplify that.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have to agree with what Dave was just saying. Shout out to the Dark Horse editorial team for sure, who recognizes new talent and old talent and just like a good story, just to begin with. So, you know,
Daniel Shaban,
yeah, Megan Walker on Count Crowley, yeah, absolutely. Tyler, what do you think makes effective?
Hey, Megan, if you're watching this, I love you. Sorry, go ahead, Tyler.
I think I agree. It's like characters. Well, I think that developing the characters what builds the stakes in a horror thing. But I think ultimately the source of the horror is almost always boils down to some sort of lack of control, where there's some sort of external force that is exerting control over somebody, hopefully a character that you love, in a way where they have to deal with it in a difficult way, in usually a painful way. And I think that the reason why it's horror is just because that's like real life, and it's sort of the worst part of real life, is having these big external forces trying to force you into something that you don't want to do, and you have to sort of find a way to deal with it, or some trying to take something away from you. I think that's why, like, the stakes are so often about death, or they're about death. Like that stuff's scary, man.
Yeah.
Being
Absolutely.
a human is scary.
It absolutely is. And I mean, personally, I think that's why I tend to gravitate to a lot like more monster focused horror, just because it's like the easy way for my brain to kind of reconcile, like Tyler, what you're saying, like just an external force taking away your control or your ability to influence things in life. And in real life, it's anything from just like, you know, just general anxieties about the way the world is, general anxieties about society, about the climate, about just work, family, anything, interpersonal relationships, anything, right? But you put a monster on that and suddenly it's something that's conquerable, terrifying and hard to kill, but is conquerable in a real way. And that is why monster horror is my comfort food in a way.
Yeah, I wish I remembered where I read this. I think it was somebody on Twitter said that, like, the reason why horror is so valuable is because it models ways to get through impossible situations.
Right. Yeah. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
There's all kinds of books I've read about why people like horror, and one of the ones that I thought was really interesting that you just mentioned, Tyler, was like sort of game theory. And the best example is how we watch zombie films and then we talk about how we would survive. Would we get in the car, go to the cabin in the woods? Would we go find a gun? Would we barricade ourselves? Do we have enough food? And so there's something at play in there where we're also sort of figuring out how to be safer in our everyday lives, which is a very human thing. There's an element of self-preservation. It's done in a fun way through fantasy. But some articles have sort of pointed out that it's speaking to something sort of deep inside of us about our own safety.
Yeah, no, that's totally legit, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. Fully. Let's talk about monsters a little bit. Since I brought that up, and I mean, both Harrow County and Count Crawley are filled with monsters. David and Tyler, and Dave as well. Everybody, what draws you to monsters? What do you like using monsters for, and what makes them particularly interesting obstacles for your heroes?
I feel like they're just so cool in the first place. Like, monsters are just they're so cool, and they are metaphorical manifestations, representations of whatever we, the creators, choose for them to be, unless they're monsters that might, be pre-existing, in which case we go back pre-mythology to mythological monsters, and everything from Gorgon, Medusa, what that represents, to Dark Ages monster mythos, and the transformation characters, and our fear of body, and what is our detachment to our body and understanding of our bodies, and the scary things that our bodies go through. And it's interesting, I think the werewolf metaphor has always been something about puberty or sexuality, which is totally legit, and I think there's awesome explorations of that, from ginger snaps all the way back to the Wolfman. But I also wonder sometimes if it's this terror that we have of what happens to our body over time, and the lack of control we have. I think it's also an amazing metaphor for mental illness, because, as someone who struggled with mental illness, and this concept that I have no control, as Tyler so wisely, pointed out, where our horror and our fear of the things we can't control, not just that is unknown, but that which we cannot control. And the one thing that we all collectively cannot control is our mortality. And as much as we try to soothe ourselves, or whatever, with whatever ways we do, it's still the thing that scares us the most. I'm going to give you a glimpse of some of my favorite. I still love the classics, and I think that each one of those guys represents its own encyclopedia of different things that we could, explore. What's fun for me as a creator right now and getting to dive into Count Crowley is because Jerry is wrestling with being a unbelieved victim, someone who struggles with perfectionism and exceptionalism, and someone who also struggles with deeply with addiction and mental health issues. For me right now at this moment, as someone who is 19 years into, my recovery, and by the time volume 2 comes out next year, it'll coincide closely with the 20th anniversary of my sobriety. I'm so excited about going back to the old grindstone and looking at werewolf horror, vampire horror, zombie horror. I'm introducing some witch horror, all tied to one thing that's really important to me, which is addiction. And ultimately, finally, the last thing I want to say on that, and I think that it's cool that, Dave, for you, Frankenstein's monster was the first monster that you really gravitated towards, because that my daughter is the same. Like the first model we did together, my kids and I, was a Frankenstein's monster model. And I've always wondered why, as kids, we felt such an affinity towards Frankenstein's monster. And I think that Emil Ferris, who's a genius, I think one of the best artists and creators working today, Emil said, there's good monsters and there's bad monsters. And I love the idea that we have to fight to defeat the bad monsters, the MAGA of the world right now, the whatever you want to call it, but that there are good monsters too. There are people that we look at in our society as monsters, addicts, people mentally unwell, people who are struggling, people who are in the darkness, people who have perhaps turned to a destructive behavior, but that's not really who they are. And we can't write them off. We have to fight for the good monsters that are out there. I think I'm a good monster who just got the chance to get, Van Helsing's cure for heroin. I'm lucky. There's a lot that are not getting that chance. So I think we have to stand up for the good monsters and fight for there's good monsters out there, and there's fucking bad monsters that we need to stomp out and destroy, and they're waiting. They're always waiting to pounce on us when we're weak, and we have to help stand up for one another.
I just want to pop in because one of the first things I ever did with my dad that I remember was making a Frankenstein's model with him. And I still have it to this day. If I was at home, I would show it. It's got glow in the dark hands and glow in the dark head. And it's one of the, if my place was on fire and I could take one thing, I would take that. It's very special to me. I lost my dad when I was 12, so I don't have a lot of those memories. And so Frankenstein, there's a connection there, but in terms of, I see Frankenstein as the ultimate metaphor, one that can grow with you. So yeah, awesome. So when I was a child, I saw this thing that was terrifying and creepy, and it scared me, but I was simultaneously attracted to it because I understood in some way there were parallels. His body was awkward and he had trouble communicating and speaking. And that's kind of what you are when you're a kid. And then I used to have a t-shirt that's with Frankenstein on it and said, if I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you. And I wore it till it fell apart because as a kid, it's very empowering. He's a giant child, but he has power, and you have no power when you're a kid. And then when I was going through puberty, I saw Frankenstein has this, I was taller than everyone in my class and I stood out and I was very awkward. I was growing so fast. I had arches in my shoes because my bones were chipping and the sleeves were too short on my clothes. And so like Frankenstein's monster, your wrist is sticking out and your body is getting awkward and you're going through changes and you have mood swings. And Frankenstein is also like an adolescent. He can't control his emotions. So you can kind of go on and follow this through. And even to old age, he's kind of like, at one point, he also represents like an old man, like his body is kind of decrepit and, he's sort of awkward in his movements and he doesn't know his place in the world and he's tried to discover it. And so anyways, I could go on, but I'm so happy you brought up Frankenstein just to let me geek out on it. But I think for me, it's just the perfect example of all the metaphors that are charged within horror and within monsters, just in that one character and that one story. There. I said my piece on Frankenstein.
Dude, that's awesome. And I totally feel you on that, like running back into the burning house. It's like, not for the passports, not for the social security cards, not for the mortgage. It's like, this was the first collective project, I think, that all three of us, my kids and I, did together, because my son and I had built like Pinewood Derby cars. But when we started modeling during the pandemic, and they did such a great job painting this, and it took everything within my power not to correct them on some of the colors, but I did. I agree with you. Everything you just said, so astute and insightful.
Yeah. Frankenstein is the poster child for good monsters, in my opinion. To bring it back to what David was talking about earlier, it's very much a victim of circumstance and upbringing, if you will, or lack thereof, and it's, you know, I don't know, not trying to get super emotional on what amounts to a panel for a comic convention. But yeah, a lot of what you guys said, I mean, really hits home with me as a person and that as a character. And I, thinking back on even my childhood, I agree. I was never afraid of the monster in Frankenstein, of Frankenstein's monster. There was never a point of watching any of the adaptations where I'm just like, this is a scary character. It was always just like, this is a very sympathetic character. And as a very young child, not really realizing or not having like the vocabulary or the really kind of self-awareness to like to see why I saw so much good in that character, or like reflecting on it now, it's just like, yeah, of course, because he's the most human character in that story. Yeah, I don't know. It's great.
Yeah,
Tyler, thoughts?
Well, the movie and the book are so different too.
Yeah.
Like, well, if we're talking about the classic Frankenstein movie, but I think in both of them, the bad guy, like the real monster, is always Dr. Frankenstein and not Frankenstein's monster, especially in the novel. Like I guess in the novel, they sort of switch back and forth between being pretty monstrous.
Yeah.
But you definitely understand like why, Frankenstein's monster does what he does, while Dr. Frankenstein's motivations are just so like shallow. You know what I mean? Like,
Frankenstein, the true story, the Jane Seymour, 1971 is like, that is where you see the more true to Mary Shelley's, I guess, like the uglier side of the narcissist kind of that's in Frankenstein's monster. But again, a creation of his creator. And I think for me as a kid from a very dysfunctional household with a father who was alcoholic and abusive, to be like, is this what I'm going to become? Am I the offshoot of this? Is a really traumatic theme that we're seeing in horror more and more now, in this renaissance that we're living in with the writers of what's happening in horror. And Lemire's Maze book, which is a Dark Horse publication, takes us into a place that's like, who am I? What am I? What is this thing that I've come from? It's really scary. Am I going to be the badness that that stuff is all, I mean, that's a book, I guess, more about like letting go and mourning. But I feel that a lot in kind of some of the newer conversations that I'm seeing in horror writing, looking inside of ourselves. My God, like the film Hereditary did that so well.
Yeah. My favorite kind of monster, though, I think, is always the monster that you don't ever see. Like, there's a movie, was it called Boogeyman? I think it was Boogeyman, that came out a couple years ago, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it's about this guy who, like, there's a boogeyman under his bed as a child, and then he sort of grew up, and then he comes back to his childhood home and is like doing this whole process where he's trying to decide if the boogeyman was real or not. And I thought that movie was absolutely brilliant up until like the last 5 minutes, when they like show the boogeyman And it was just like, oh, I was so scared of this guy. And now all of a sudden, like, oh, the boogeyman's just computer generated. So it's not very scary anymore.
Yeah.
So it's like, and in fact, I've been working on a story on my Instagram where it's kind of on hold right now, but I've been posting like a panel per day doing a horror story. And the whole premise of that one has been like, how little can I give the reader every day? Like how long can I stretch it out? Like not ever letting anyone know what's actually happening here. And I think that stuff is very scary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's lighten it up a little bit. Let's lighten it up a little bit more. We got super intimate and personal and a little dark, which I love, and it's great. But yeah, what are your favorite parts about working in the horror genre, just as a person? All of you, everybody.
For me, the collaborative experience thus far of having an idea in my imagination for so long, and then the first time that I turned a script in and then I got notes back from my editor, Megan Walker, and then the first time that Lucas Kettner sent me what his hand and imagination could do with what my imagination and my words could do, was to me like the essence of like what it means to be a human being, like why we tell stories, why we do what we do. I just it was a really profound effect on me, because yeah, it's horror and monsters and it's comic books and it's, you know, fun, but like, my God, the seeing that manifest in a digital PDF file from something he had drawn in Oregon and then was sent to me, and I opened it and I was like, that's better than my imagination, 10 times, a million times more incredible than even my imagination was for it. And the second thing, and this will never get old, was whether it's walking into Clint's Comics, which is my childhood comic shop in Kansas City, or Earth 2 down the block in LA, or any other comic shop around the world, and seeing Jerry Bartman or a Count Crowley comic on a shelf, it's just hard to describe. It's like, yeah, it's so good. It's so good.
Tyler, Dave, favorite parts about working in horror or just creative field in general?
Working at home is awesome. I mean, even before pandemic, being able to do that. Before this, I worked in a studio doing video games before I switched over to comics full time. And just being able to be at home with my wife and my dogs is so awesome. That's like one of my favorites. Horror in general, though, like I think I like, well, you know, I've always like loved kind of spooky-ish stuff. And like my favorite shirt growing up was a Skull Skates shirt, even though I didn't really have a Skull Skates skateboard or any of that stuff. But and there was sort of an ongoing joke where my mom would always tell me that skulls aren't decorative. And nowadays, you know, it's like I have a skull like almost within reach of any place in the house right now. So maybe I win the argument.
Yeah, there you go. Dave, how about you?
I'd say for me, it's just meeting sort of like-minded misfits, and the level of passion. I think, like, I have a degree in film and media, and I like genres outside of horror that I'm passionate about, but I gravitated towards horror because I think some of the most imaginative stuff is happening there. Some of the most passionate creators are there. And I think overall, the genre tells us more about who we are than any other genre, because I think everything we do as human beings is motivated by our, you know, thoughts about mortality, our fear of death, whether it's wanting to procreate and pass along our DNA, or, you know, live to be 100 or stay safe, or whatever, right? I think if you boil everything down, fear is really our chief motivating factor, and that's what horror is about. So I find it very fascinating.
Speaking of, you're right, the community, Dave, is huge. I think that being able to connect with fans, one of my favorite things is whenever I open Instagram and there's another passionate horror fan that has connected with either Jerry or another character in Count Crowley, and seeing the cosplays and the fan art is like, oh man, it's so cool. It's so cool. I've got files just save all that stuff because I love it.
Like Tyler, it must be so satisfying for you when there's this idea of a creature, a monster, and you get to work through it, and then it ends up living on the page. And I know in Harrow County, I'm seeing stuff that I've never seen anywhere else before. And for a dyed-in-the-wool horror fan, that is super satisfying. I'd love to hear your take on that part of the process.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I work in comics in general is I like drawing things that sort of have a life to them. Like there was a point when I was making video games, most of my career was spent working on a video game called Game Day, where it was a football game for PlayStation. And I remember the very first time I saw a character that I had modeled, like running around on the field and doing his thing, I was like, I flipped my lid. I could not believe that some art that I made could have an adventure even on a stupid football field, doing its thing. And that's sort of really how I feel about all my drawings, is like everything I draw. If I make a drawing that feels like there's a real person or a real monster and they're having some sort of adventure and things are actually happening to these completely fictional drawings that I made up, like that's the most exciting thing in the world to me, is just that feeling of creating life out of nothing, and creating a whole world out of nothing. Like that stuff is really exciting. The monster stuff, I don't know. People debate me on this all the time. I don't think I'm that great of a monster designer.
Debate.
But I
Debate.
also came on to, like, my intro to working comics full time was coming right after Guy Davis, who is like probably the greatest living monster designer of our time. So maybe I'm just comparing myself to him too much, but I always feel like my monsters are never quite capturing the thing that I wanted to capture. But I mean, that's probably true for all art. You try your hardest, you shoot for the best you can do, and you just get as close as you can to what you're trying to hit.
I think you're probably hardest critic, Tyler. I think everyone on this panel would disagree that you're not a good monster designer.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm an okay monster designer. I just don't think I'm as good as some people think. But
I'm glad that you keep thinking that, because that way you're just going to keep making more amazing shit, because you're just like, oh, well, I mean, but for the rest of us, it's so awesome, man. Well,
thanks, guys.
Yeah. When I first saw that, like the skinless boy, and you can debate whether that's a monster or not, but visually, man, I was just like over the moon. It was so cool, man. So
yeah.
I think you're full of crap.
I was really scared about that one, actually, because Cullen had it in the script and he described it exactly how I drew it. And I was so worried that it was just going to look corny. In my mind, when I read it on the script, I was like, oh man, that sounds so corny.
No, I'm going to geek out on Harrow County for like 2 seconds, because this was a series that started coming out when I was in college. And it was like my second resurgence into comics after, like, I was really into comics as a little kid, fell out of it in like end of middle school through high school because, trying to be cool, whatever the hell that means at that time. And then got to college and then realized you can just be yourself, and that, like, that's a much more satisfying way to live your life. And so me and my friends were really getting back into comics at that time, like reading Saga and East to West and stuff like that. And I remember my buddy Nate was like, hey, my brother told me about this really cool comic. It just came out. Issue 1 just came out. It's called Harrow County. Let's go get it. So I was living in San Francisco at the time. So I went to our local comic shop, which is unfortunately closed now. Didn't survive the past few years. But they didn't have it. They didn't have the issue 1, and so he had it special ordered along with like a copy of issue 2. And then when issue 2 came out, they had ordered like 3 copies of issue 2. And then when issue 3 came out, they had ordered like 5 copies of issue 3. And by the time like issue 5 came out, they were ordering like 15 copies of it because they're just like, you know, at first not knowing really what this is, but as it just progressed, it's just like, oh, people want this and it's great. But I think it was that issue 1 cover that had like the skinless boy's skin like crawling out of the drawer, and I remember seeing that cover when my buddy Nate finally got that issue. I was like, oh my god, what is this? This is amazing. So Harrow County was a huge part of me like getting back into comics as like an adult. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks. That issue 1 cover is a little bit funny because that was actually supposed to be issue 2 when I drew it. And then as soon as I turned it in, they, editorial was like, no, we're going to switch 1 and 2 because like that's the better cover for 1.
Yeah,
totally true.
It 100%. I mean, that cover set the tone for me personally for like what that series was going to be. And throughout its, what was that, 36 issues, 34 issues?
I think we did 32.
32. Okay. I mean, throughout that entire run, it stayed true. I mean, it stayed true to what my expectations were, while also just like every arc just surpassing what I thought was possible with Harrow. So,
thanks, dude.
Yeah, thanks for getting me through some of those stuff in college. I appreciate that.
Well, that's our goal. It's just kids through college, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up on time here, but let's just go around and say what any cool comic recommendations you have for any of our viewers at home, besides obviously Count Crowley, Reluctant Midnight Monster Hunter, which everybody should go pick up, besides Harrow County and Manor Black and the 2 Tales from Harrow County series that are happening right now, with that first one with artist Naomi Franquise and the current one, Emily Schnall. And then also Untold Horror, if you just want a cool book of like interviews about unproduced screenplays for some of your favorite directors and some of your favorite monster movies or just movies in general. But if anybody wants to go around and give out a few recommendations besides your wonderful books.
Well, I would say if you want some really good classic horror, go find Swamp Thing that Bernie Wrightson started Swamp Thing, and dude's amazing. One of my favorite artists of all time. But Nestor Redondo, the guy who came right after him, is, I think, one of the most talented comic book artists to have ever worked in the medium. And I would sure like more people to go read more of his comics. He did Swamp Thing, and he did a bunch of House of Secrets, and he did oh man, gosh, what's the Jungle Woman book? I can't remember what it's called.
Nope. Jungle Woman?
Anyway. Say what?
The Jungle Woman. I'm trying to think.
Nima?
Or
no, that isn't right, but something. But anyway, Nestor Redondo is the guy. Look him up. Yeah. I've just watched Us too, as far as horror movies go.
Great movie.
It was a great movie. I thought that was really good. Jordan Peele is so good at taking like really profoundly goofy ideas and making them like really honestly scary and good.
Yeah, I fully agreed.
I will recommend from the Dark Horse library, anybody who hasn't started collecting them yet, and it's almost Halloween season, there's going to be lots of good stuff from Dark Horse for you to order. But the compendium books that they published of the classic creepy and eerie's, I've been collecting them over the years, and I now have all of them. But this is an example. You get just so many great classic comics that if you're like me and you try to collect the originals, that's great, but those can be expensive, and getting them all in one book so lovingly assembled is a really fun way to spend an evening, straying away from Dark Horse, just making sure anybody who loves horror has read Something's Killing the Children from Boom, which is fantastic. Again, Rodney's work on Philadelphia, I think, is really special right now. I really loved what happened with Stray Dogs, and even over in the old school Marvel guys are doing some cool stuff with horror. In my opinion, it's kind of a Cronenberg take on Banner and the Hulk with what's happening with the Immoral Hulk and Flatline. I really love that. And that's it. But go to darkhorse.com first and see what you're going to buy. And then with whatever change you got left over, you go to them other guys. Okay.
For me, I would definitely, I mean, obviously doing Untold Horror, I think you should check out the Dark Horse releases of the unproduced Alien screenplays. Those are super cool. You can see sort of what guys like William Gibson, Dan O'Bannon were cooking up earlier on in the thought process for the Alien universe. And there's just tons of Alien screenplays floating around out there that didn't make it. So that's really satisfying to see Dark Horse recognizing that, oh, these are actually really great story. Let's bring them to life. And then one non-Dark Horse I would recommend is if you love body horror, you should be checking out Junji Ito. His stuff is insane, and I've been in love with it for years. And if you're looking for a place to start, check out Gyo, Gyo. It'll blow your mind. It's one of the most imaginative, bizarre, cool stories I've ever seen. So I'll leave it at those two, even though I could give you a bunch more. It's a great time for comics.
It is a great time for comics. I'll recommend a title David actually brought up earlier in this panel, which is Beasts of Burden. Evan Dorkin's amazing story about supernatural animals fighting supernatural evil forces in their town of Burden Hill. Original artist Jill Thompson on that original run, and now is working with Benjamin Dewey on the current run of those series. But phenomenal series. Everybody should read it. And then I'll recommend a couple of manga too from Dark Horse. Berserk, which is a very long-running, much beloved series, which has spawned an anime, like multiple anime and a video game. But like Berserk is what it's the inspiration for games like the Dark Souls franchise and so much more in terms of just like weird body horror and weird monster horror. And it all originates with Berserk. A lot of those guys will call back to Berserk as like, this is the inspiration. Published by Dark Horse for the American English translation. And then also we did an English translation of an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness in 2 volumes. Which is also
that one was
phenomenal,
beautiful book
manga adaptation. So yeah, a lot of good stuff from Dark Horse and other publishers as well. I could wax poetic all day long about my favorite horror stuff happening in comics right now, but we do not have the time. But thank you everybody for speaking with me, for speaking with all of us at home about horror, and just for agreeing to participate in this. If you want to go around, Dave, we'll start with you. You can tell people where they can find you online, if they can find you online.
Yeah, we've got a website for Untold Horror. You can Google it. It's very easy to find. We've also got Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for Untold Horror. It comes up pretty easy if you search for it at Untold Horror. And if you're looking for my stuff, I'm on Instagram at Only Blood or Love. That's my handle.
Tyler, how about you?
I have a website. It's mrcrook.com, and on all the socials, I'm usually Mr. Crook or Mr. Tyler Crook. Pretty easy to find, I think. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Don't do Facebook. But yeah, sign up for my newsletter, maybe. That'd be fun.
David, how about you?
Do it. I'm at Dastmalchian on social media, so at and then my long last name, which go to Google, you'll figure it out. I don't have time on this panel to spell it for you guys. And then Count Crowley has an Instagram that really wonderful guy is running, and he's not only a fan but he's a good friend, and he's doing such great stuff, sharing content on the Instagram there. just remember to go see, get vaccinated, be safe, and then go see Dune next month on the biggest screen you can possibly see it on. Unless you feel unsafe, then you can stay home and watch it on your freaking TV. But please, if you can make it, you've got to see it on the biggest screen possible. It's going to rock your mind. And there's a lot of wonderful horror moments in this film that will really unnerve and disturb you. And I get to be part of some of it.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been Dark Forces Horror Hour, or whatever we ended up calling the panel. Either way, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much. I sincerely appreciate you taking the time. And everybody watching at home, thank you for spending an hour with us and listening to us talk about Frankenstein and horror and monsters and everything in between. Stay safe, everybody. Have a good one. Thank you.